The snow came down like it meant to bury the whole world, and it was in the pale gray hush of that February afternoon in 1874 that Seth Kendrick found something he had not been looking for: a woman lying still as fallen timber 3 miles from Carlson's Pass. Her dark hair fanned across the white ground and her lips the color of winter plums. And for one terrible moment he thought she was already gone. He had been running his trap line along the eastern ridge of the San Juan Mountains in Colorado Territory, moving fast because the sky had taken on that flat pewter look that meant serious weather was still coming. The kind of weather that could close a man inside his own cabin for a week if he did not get his pelts gathered and his supplies laid in before nightfall. Seth Kendrick was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders and lean everywhere else, with hands that were rough from rope and cold, and a face that the mountain sun had tanned the color of old saddle leather. He had been living alone in these mountains for 4 years, ever since he had come west from Missouri with nothing but a mule, a good rifle, and enough stubbornness to fill a river canyon. He was not a man who startled easily. He had faced down a grizzly bear near the Animas River the previous spring without raising his voice above a measured murmur. But when he crested that last ridge and saw the small shape pressed into the snowdrift below the tree line, his heart lurched sideways in his chest in a way that genuinely surprised him. He came down the slope fast, his snowshoes hissing through the packed crust, and he knelt beside her and pressed 2 fingers to the side of her throat where the pulse would be if there was one. There was, faint and slow, but there. He pulled his hand back and studied her for a long moment, reading the situation the way he had been trained by years of wilderness living to read everything carefully, without letting emotion cloud the facts. She was young, maybe 23 or 24, dressed in a wool traveling coat that was decent quality but entirely inadequate for mountain conditions. Her boots were town boots, not trail boots, and one of them had a broken heel. She had a carpetbag clutched in one gloved hand, and the gloves themselves were thin. The kind a woman wore to church rather than the kind a woman wore when she expected to walk 3 miles through a February snowstorm at 7,000 feet of elevation. He looked back in the direction she must have come from, toward the pass, and he could see the faint line of her tracks in the snow, already half filled with fresh powder, meandering and unsteady, the tracks of someone who had been walking for a long time and had been getting colder with every step. She had sat down against the base of this particular pine tree, and she had not gotten up again. That was the whole story, as far as the snow could tell it. He did not know her name. He did not know where she was trying to go. He did not know why she had been on foot in this weather without proper equipment, and none of those things mattered at that particular moment, because what mattered was getting her warm before her body stopped trying to save itself. He untied his pack carefully, keeping his movements slow and deliberate, and he pulled out the blanket he always carried and tucked it around her. And then he did something that would have surprised anyone who knew him well. He gathered her up in his arms, carpetbag and all, as gently as if she were made of something breakable, and he began to walk. She did not wake. He was careful that she did not wake, moving smoothly, absorbing the uneven ground with his legs so that she would not be jostled. It was 3 miles back to his cabin from this point, and they were 3 of the hardest miles in the San Juan Range, steep in places and cut through with frozen creek beds, and the snow was picking up speed, and the light was already going gray-gold at the edges the way it did an hour before dark. Seth Kendrick settled the woman against his chest and kept walking, and he did not stop once. The first mile was the worst, going down through a boulder field where the footing was treacherous even without the extra weight, and he moved with the patience of a man who knew exactly what carelessness cost in these mountains. She was lighter than he had expected. He could feel the cold coming off her even through the blanket and his own heavy coat, and he walked faster, not so fast that he risked a fall, but as fast as the ground would allow. The second mile crossed the frozen creek twice, and both times he tested the ice with one foot before committing his full weight in hers, because a man who broke through the ice in these temperatures carrying an unconscious woman was not going to come out of that story well for either of them. She stirred once, somewhere in the middle of that second mile, turning her face slightly toward the warmth of his chest, and he felt her exhale a long, slow breath that was almost a sigh, like something releasing in her, and then she was still again. He kept walking. The third mile was familiar ground to him, the slope he had walked 100 times in all weathers, and he came down it with increasing speed as his cabin came into view below, the dark log walls already wearing a good cap of snow on the roof, a thin line of smoke rising from the chimney because he had banked the fire before he left that morning out of long habit. He was grateful for that habit now, in a way he had never been before. He got the cabin door open with his shoulder, having learned years ago that a door which required 2 free hands to open was a door that would eventually kill you, and he carried her inside and laid her down on the bed. His own bed, the only bed there was, and he pulled off her wet coat and her ruined boots with practiced efficiency, and he added 3 logs to the banked fire until it roared up good and strong. And then he pulled every blanket he owned over her and stood back and looked at her in the firelight. She had color coming back to her face already, the dangerous marble pale giving way to something more human, a faint flush climbing into her cheeks as the warmth of the cabin began to reach her. Her dark hair was loose around her face, still damp at the edges, and even half frozen and sleeping the sleep of the exhausted she was, Seth Kendrick thought, the most striking woman he had ever seen up close. He recognized this thought, filed it away in the back of his mind without acting on it, and went to put water on to heat. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say yet, and he was not a man who talked just to hear the sound of his own voice. He made coffee and heated broth from the venison he had put up last week, and he kept the fire going, and he sat in the chair by the hearth and watched her breathe, and he said nothing at all until she was warm. She woke at 7:15 by his pocket watch, which had been his father's, and which kept reliable time even in the cold as long as he remembered to wind it. The firelight was the only light in the cabin, throwing warm moving shadows up the log walls, and the snow outside was coming down in earnest now, a real mountain storm, the kind that would have buried her where she sat if he had run his trap line an hour later. She opened her eyes and they were the color of strong coffee, dark brown with a ring of something warmer around the center, and she looked at the ceiling of his cabin for a long moment before she turned her head and looked at him. He met her gaze and said, "You are warm now. Not who are you, not what were you doing out there, not you nearly died, just that." She was warm now. It seemed like the most important fact. She stared at him for another moment, and then she sat up slowly, pulling the blankets around her shoulders, and she looked around the cabin at the fire, at the pelts hanging on the walls, at his rifle on its rack, at the iron stove and the single window with snow packed against the glass, and then she looked back at him. "You carried me," she said. It was not a question. "Yes. From out there. From the east ridge below the pines, about 3 miles. She was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Then she said, "I sat down. I was only going to sit for a moment." "That is how it happens," he said. "The cold makes you tired, and then it makes you feel almost comfortable, and then it makes you sleep, and then you do not wake up. It is not a painful way to go, which is the one thing to be said for it." She looked at him steadily. "You said that very plainly. I thought you would rather have it plain than soft-pedaled." Something moved across her face then, not offense, but something more like recognition, like a woman who had been told too many comfortable lies and found the plain version of things unexpectedly refreshing. "Yes," she said. "I would." She pulled her hair back from her face with both hands, and he saw her wince as the circulation came fully back to her fingers. "Rosa Shepard," she said, holding her right hand out toward him in the formal way, the way people did when they were trying to establish themselves as someone real. He got up from the chair and crossed to the bed and shook her hand. Even through the lingering chill of her fingers, her grip was firm. "Seth Kendrick, are you the trapper people mention when they talk about the upper San Juans?" I expect I am the only trapper in the upper San Juan, so that follows." She almost smiled. He saw it, the corner of her mouth lifting just briefly, before she brought it back down to neutral. She was still working out how she felt about finding herself in a stranger's cabin with a storm howling outside, and he respected that. It was a reasonable situation to work through carefully. "There is venison broth on the stove," he said, going back to the fire and picking up the pan. "You should eat. It will help." She nodded and pulled herself upright against the wall, arranging the blankets with a kind of determined dignity. And he brought her a tin cup of broth and watched her wrap both hands around it the way a person does when their hands are very cold and the warmth of something is almost a physical pleasure. She drank without speaking for a little while, and he went back to his chair, and the fire talked between them, the pine logs popping and settling. "I was coming from Durango," she said finally. "I was trying to reach the Hargrove homestead. The Hargroves were relations of my mother's family, cousins twice removed. I was given to understand they were expecting me." "The Hargroves are 12 miles on the far side of the pass," Seth said. She absorbed this. "I know that. I had a horse." Had. She threw a shoe coming out of the last creek crossing, and then she spooked at something in the trees. I never saw what, and she was gone. I held the reins for as long as I could, but the ground was icy and she was frightened, and I could not hold her. She looked down at the cup. "I thought the pass was closer. I thought if I could reach the pass I could see the Hargrove Valley from the top and someone would see me coming." "No one would see you in this weather," he said. "And the pass would have been worse than the ridge. It funnels the wind, something extraordinary." "I know that now," she said quietly, and there was something in those 3 words, patient, a little wry, and underneath it all, something that had clearly been a very hard year, that made him look at her more carefully. She did not seem like a woman who frightened easily or complained readily. She seemed like a woman who had been navigating difficult circumstances with insufficient help for some time, and who had learned to recalibrate her expectations without much fuss. "Where did you come from?" he asked. "Before Durango." She looked up at him. "Kansas City. Before that, a town in Missouri called Hartwell, which you will not have heard of because there was almost nothing to it." She paused. "My father died this past October. There was nothing left in Hartwell for me after that. The cousins in the Hargrove Valley were the only family I had that I knew of, so I wrote to them and they wrote back and said come. So I came." "October to February," Seth said. "It took time to settle the estate, such as it was." Her voice was level, but he heard the shape of what she was not saying, that the estate had been less than expected, that the settling of it had been complicated, that she had arrived in Colorado territory with a carpetbag and broken plans, and the last of whatever she had managed to hold on to. He did not press. He got up instead and checked the fire and looked out the window at the storm, which had not lessened. And then he went to the small shelf where he kept what passed for his pantry and began to put together something more substantial than broth for her supper. "You do not have to feed me," she said. "You need to eat," he said without turning around. "I have food in my bag. I had biscuits from Durango. Your bag is on the floor by the door and your biscuits are wet through and frozen solid by now," he said. "I have salt pork and dried beans, and I have cornbread if you want it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Cornbread sounds very good." He made cornbread in the iron skillet with the confident ease of a man who had been cooking for himself in a mountain cabin for 4 years, and had long since made peace with the limited repertoire required. He fried slices of salt pork until they crisped at the edges, and he put a cup of coffee in her hand while she waited, and she held it the same way she had held the broth, like warmth itself was a thing worth savoring. They ate at his small table across from each other, and she ate with the focused attention of someone who had not had a proper meal since morning, and he was glad he had made enough. Outside, the storm pressed against the cabin walls with a sound like breathing. "How long will it last?" she asked, looking toward the window. 2 days, he said. "Maybe 3, it has that feeling." She nodded slowly, and he watched her work through the mathematics of this. 3 days in a stranger's cabin. 3 days before she could continue to the Hargrove homestead. 3 days of uncertainty and dependence on a man she did not know. He recognized the particular set of her jaw that came with a woman who was independent by necessity rather than choice, who had learned that asking for help often cost more than it saved, and who was now in a situation where she had no choice but to accept it. "I will sleep in the chair," he said. She looked up at him quickly. "You take the bed," he said. "It is the only reasonable arrangement. It is your bed, and you are my guest. Such as this place runs to guests." He stood and began to clear the dishes, and the conversation was finished as far as he was concerned. She looked at his broad back for a moment, and then she looked down at her empty plate and she said, "Thank you, Seth Kendrick." And she said it with a gravity that went well past the ordinary use of the words, the gravity of a woman who understood exactly what she was being thanked for and meant every syllable. He said, "You are welcome, Rosa Shepard," and he went on washing the plates. The storm lasted 2.5 days. In those 2.5 days, Seth Kendrick learned more about Rosa Shepard than he had learned about any single human being in the 4 years he had spent in these mountains. And he was not entirely sure how it happened, because he was not by nature a man who collected information about people, and she was not by nature a woman who offered it freely. But there was something about being snowbound together in a space 14 feet by 16 feet, with a fire between you and 40 inches of fresh snow outside the door, that loosened the normal reserve between strangers, the way spring loosened the mountain creeks. He learned that she was 24 years old, that she had been her father's keeper and caretaker for the last 3 years of his illness, that she had not had a real conversation with another person her own age in what felt like a very long time. He learned that she had been engaged once, briefly, to a man in Hartwell named Thomas Purdy, who had found someone with a better financial situation, when it became clear that Rosa's father's illness would consume whatever small inheritance there might have been. She told this story with the same level matter-of-factness with which she told most things, but her eyes went very still when she said the man's name, and Seth read in that stillness the exact dimensions of the wound, not the wound of heartbreak, which heals, but the deeper wound of betrayal by someone you had trusted, which takes considerably longer. He learned that she could play a fair game of cards, that she had opinions about the proper use of sage in venison stew that were both strong and largely correct, that she laughed at unexpected things and not at expected things, and that she had 3 books in her carpet bag, wrapped in oilcloth against the wet, which he found impressive both as a precaution and as a priority. She learned things about him too, though he was harder to read and he knew it. She learned that he had come west after a period of his life. He referred to only obliquely something in Missouri, something that had closed a door on the life he might have lived in a town with other people, and that he had found in these mountains something that suited him in a way that towns never had. She learned that he had a younger sister in St. Louis named Clara, who wrote letters that reached him in Durango 3 or 4 times a year. She learned that he had built this cabin himself, log by log, and that he knew every board and beam of it with the intimacy of a man who had made a thing with his own hands and his own labor. On the second evening of the storm, she found his sister's most recent letter on the shelf where he kept it, not reading it, just picking it up and setting it down again, and she said, "She writes with a good hand." "She always did," he said. "She had more patience for school than I did." "Do you miss her?" He considered the question as he always considered questions without hurry. "Yes," he said, "I expect I do." "Does she know what your life is like up here?" "I have tried to tell her." "I am not sure she believes it is as rough as it is. I think she imagines something more like a house and less like—" He gestured at the cabin around them, the rough logs and the fur pelts and the single window and the pervasive smell of wood smoke and pine. "This." Rosa looked around the cabin with an expression he was beginning to recognize as her thoughtful face, eyebrows slightly drawn, head tilted a degree to the left, taking everything in and organizing it into some internal picture that he was never entirely sure he understood. "I think it is exactly right," she said. For what it is, he looked at her. A place built by someone who knows what they are doing and knows what they need, she clarified. That is not a small thing. He thought about that for a while after she had gone to sleep, sitting by the dying fire with his coffee going cold in his hand, thinking about what it meant that this woman, who had come out of the cold and into his life by pure accident 3 days ago, had looked at everything he had made and said it was right. He could not have explained why it mattered. It simply did. On the morning of the third day, the storm broke. The silence woke Seth before dawn, the sudden absence of the wind's voice against the walls, the deep mountain quiet that comes after a big snow, when the whole world is padded and muffled and still. He went to the door and opened it and looked out at a landscape transformed, the peaks above catching the first pale light of a clear sky, every tree bowed under its white burden, the path down to the creek invisible under 3 feet of unbroken snow. He was pulling on his coat to start clearing when he heard her behind him. "It stopped," she said. "Yes." She came and stood beside him in the doorway, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her, looking out at the world made new by the storm. She had borrowed one of his flannel shirts to sleep in, and she was wearing her wool coat over it now, and her dark hair was loose and unbrushed, and she stood there looking at the snow-covered mountains with an expression he had not seen on her face before, something open and wondering, the defended quality she wore most of the time temporarily lifted. "It is beautiful," she said. "It is," he agreed. They stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the white world together, and then he stepped out to begin digging, and she stepped back inside to make the coffee, and neither of them mentioned the moment after. But it sat between them for the rest of that day, warm and quiet, like a coal that had not yet decided whether to go out or catch. She should have left the next morning. The trail to the pass was cleared enough, and the sky was holding blue, and the Hargroves would be wondering where she was. He had packed her a proper supply for the trail, dried meat and hardtack, and a small flask of coffee. And he had found a pair of proper trail boots in his stores that were 2 sizes too large, but that she could make work with 2 pairs of socks, and he had looked at her broken-heeled town boots and said nothing at all because there was nothing useful to say about them. He had written a note to the Hargroves in his careful blocky handwriting, explaining what had happened, so she would not arrive a stranger without context. She was ready to go. Her carpetbag was packed and her borrowed blanket was folded neatly at the foot of his bed, and her 3 books were wrapped in their oilcloth again. She was standing at the door with her coat buttoned and her practical expression in place, the open, wondering look of the doorway moment packed away somewhere out of sight. And then she said, "The trail to the pass, you know it, better than I know most things. Would you—" She stopped, started again. "I am not asking out of fear. I know the way well enough now, I think. But if you were going that direction anyway for any reason, I will take you to the pass," he said. She looked at him with those coffee-dark eyes and she said, "You do not have to." "I know that," he said, and he picked up his own pack and his rifle and he held the door open for her, and she walked out into the blue sky morning and he followed her. The walk to the pass took 4 hours through the deep snow, and it was some of the best 4 hours Seth Kendrick could recall having in recent memory, which was information he stored away in the back of his mind with the same care with which he stored everything that mattered. She walked well. Better than he had expected, given the oversized boots, picking her way through the snow with a natural sense of the terrain, asking good questions about the route and listening carefully to the answers. She pointed out a pair of elk moving through the trees above them on the ridge, and she said, "They are magnificent," in the tone of someone who had not yet gotten accustomed to such things and intended to stay that way. They stopped at midpoint to eat hardtack and dried meat, and the last of the morning's coffee, poured from the flask into their 2 cups, sitting on a fallen log that was itself buried to the point of being almost a snowdrift. She told him about Kansas City, about the boarding house where she had stayed for the 2 months between leaving Hartwell and taking the train south to Durango, about the particular loneliness of a city where no one knew your name. He told her about his first winter in these mountains, which had been very nearly his last, when he had misjudged the early cold and found himself snowed in without enough provisions, and had spent 3 months eating his own pack mule's feed to supplement what he could trap. She laughed out loud at this, a full real laugh, and it was the first time he had heard that sound from her, unguarded and genuine, and it landed somewhere in his chest with the force of a small, unexpected gift. They reached the pass at early afternoon, and he walked her to the top of it, where the trail turned down toward the Hargrove Valley on the far side, and they stood together at the highest point looking out across miles of white mountain in every direction, the sky a blue so deep and clear it looked painted, the air cold and sharp and clean. She turned and looked at him, and she said, "From here I can find it." "The Hargrove place is the second smoke you will see," he said. "First is the Birch Ranch, which is closer but not your people. Keep on another mile past it." "I will." There was a pause. The wind at the pass was cold and steady, and it moved a strand of her hair across her face, and she pushed it back with one gloved hand, and she looked at him in a way that he could not entirely categorize, which was unusual because he was generally good at categorizing things. "Seth," she said. "Rosa," he said, equally quiet. "I have been rude about expressing this, I think." "Because I was." She seemed to search for the right word, overwhelmed at the beginning. "And then I did not want to make it into something large and sentimental, because that is not my way. But you saved my life. You would have been found. I would have been found frozen to that tree when the snow stopped," she said with her particular directness. "You saved my life, and you gave me your bed and your food and your blankets, and you walked me through 4 hours of mountain snow on a morning when you had other things to do. And I want you to know that I know what that is worth." She met his eyes steadily. "I am not a woman who forgets what she owes." "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I know you believe that," she said. "I believe it too, in the sense you mean it. You did not do it expecting payment, and I know that. But I want you to understand that I know. That I will not forget." She held out her hand to shake his, the formal way, the way she had introduced herself in the cabin that first evening. He took her hand and shook it, and then, he was not entirely sure why he did this. He was not a demonstrative man by any measure. He held onto it for half a second longer than a handshake required, and she noticed, and she did not pull away. "Go safely," he said. "Go warmly," she said, and the corner of her mouth lifted in that almost smile, and then she turned and started down the far side of the pass, and he stood at the top and watched her until the trail curved and the mountain took her from his sight. He walked back to his cabin alone. It was longer going back. It always was. He did not see Rosa Shepard for 17 days after that, and in those 17 days he thought about her with a frequency that he recognized as outside the ordinary, and which he could not seem to reduce by keeping himself occupied, though he tried. He ran his trap lines. He repaired the section of roof that had taken damage in the storm. He wrote a letter to his sister Clara in St. Louis that was longer than usual, not because he mentioned Rosa. He did not mention Rosa, but because the silence in the cabin had taken on a different quality since she had left it, and writing helped him not to notice the quality of the silence quite so much. He went into Durango on the 22nd of February for supplies and to sell his winter pelts to Garrison at the trading post. And Garrison, who knew everything about everyone in a radius of 60 miles, and considered this knowledge his professional obligation, told him that a Miss Rosa Shepard was staying at the Hargrove homestead on the far side of the pass, and that Mrs. Hargrove, a considerable and opinionated woman named Hattie, had declared the young woman entirely satisfactory and intended to make use of her. Make use of her how? Seth asked, more sharply than he intended. Garrison raised an eyebrow, teaching the young ones their letters and numbers. "The Hargroves have got 4 children under 12 and no school within 14 miles. Miss Shepard apparently has some education." He paused. "You know her. She came through the pass in the storm last week," Seth said neutrally. "I put her up while it blew out." "Did you now?" said Garrison, in the tone of a man filing information away for future use. Seth bought his flour and his salt and his coffee and his ammunition, and he went back up the mountain. And he did not think about the way Garrison had said "did you now" for more than an hour, which was reasonably good discipline. He did not go to the Hargrove homestead. There was no reason to go to the Hargrove homestead. He had delivered her safely to the pass, and the debt of the rescue, which had never been a debt in the way she had called it, but which he understood as a completed transaction between them, was closed. She had her cousins and her new work teaching the children and the life she had come to Colorado territory to find. He had his mountain and his trap lines and his cabin, and the quality of his silence, and the letter to his sister that he had not finished yet. He was 2 miles up the East Ridge Trail, checking his second trap, when he heard the horse. He heard it before he saw it, the particular crunch of hooves on crusted snow, moving fast on the trail below, and he came down off the ridge with his hand near his rifle, because fast horses on mountain trails in winter did not generally mean good news. He came through the trees and stopped, because it was Rosa Shepard on a sturdy bay mare, moving up the trail at a pace that suggested she knew where she was going and had decided to get there quickly. She pulled up when she saw him, the mare snorting twin puffs of steam in the cold air, and she looked down at him from the saddle with an expression he could not immediately read. "I was looking for you," she said. He stood very still. "You found me. Hattie Hargrove told me your trap line runs up the East Ridge," she said. "I have been riding for an hour and a half." "That is a long way to ride in February," he said, meaning it as an observation rather than a reproach. "I needed to ask you something," she said, and it seemed better to ask in person than to send a note with whoever was next going over the pass. She dismounted in a single clean movement, the mare standing steady, and she came and stood in front of him in the snow with her boots, proper trail boots this time, he noticed, with proper heels planted firmly and her chin level and her eyes very direct. "The Hargroves have a spring dance. The first Saturday in March, which is 11 days from now. They hold it at the homestead. People come from all over the valley, Hattie says, from 30 miles around." He waited. "I would like you to come," she said, "as my guest." As she stopped briefly, and for the first time since he had known her, something uncertain crossed her face. Not uncertainty about him, he thought, but uncertainty about herself, about whether she was being correct or proper or too forward by any measure that applied out here on a mountain in 1874. And then that uncertainty resolved into something simpler and more honest. "Because I would like to see you again," she said. "And I did not know another way to arrange it that did not require you to come looking for me first, and I thought that if I waited for that I might wait a very long time." He looked at her for a long moment. "You are not wrong about the waiting," he said. That made her smile, a real one this time, not the almost smile, a full warm smile that did something significant to the ordinary appearance of the world. "Is that a yes?" "That is a yes," he said. She nodded once decisively, like a woman who had accomplished a thing she set out to accomplish. "Good." She looked around at the ridge, at the snow and the silent pines and the mountain above them. "Will you show me where your traps are?" He blinked. "Now, I rode an hour and a half," she said. "I am not going straight back down." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "This way," and he turned and led her up the ridge. And she tied the mare and followed him through the snow, and he showed her the trap line, and she asked intelligent questions about the pelts and the trails, and they walked for 2 hours through the winter mountains together, talking more freely than they had even in the snowbound cabin, as though the outdoors suited them both better than 4 walls, and the conversation simply opened up wider when the sky was overhead. And by the time they came back down to her mare, and he boosted her into the saddle, she was laughing at something he had said about a particularly uncooperative beaver, and the sound of it followed him for a long time after she had ridden back down the trail toward the pass. The Hargrove spring dance was the most well-attended thing Seth Kendrick had been to in 4 years of mountain living, which was not saying a great deal given that the most well-attended thing he had been to in those 4 years was Garrison's trading post on a busy Saturday. But he put on his best shirt, which was clean and only moderately frayed at the cuffs, and he brushed his coat, and he rode the 14 miles to the Hargrove homestead on a clear, cold Saturday night with the stars showing hard and bright above the mountains. And when he arrived and found Rosa Shepard standing in the Hargrove yard talking to a neighboring woman, and wearing a blue dress he had never seen before, a dress that was clearly her best, and was the particular blue of a fall sky at elevation. He stood with his horse's reins in his hand for a full 3 seconds before he remembered to move. She saw him and she said something brief to the neighboring woman, and she came across the yard toward him, and the way she walked, purposeful, straight-backed, with that particular quality she had of moving like a woman who knew exactly where she was going and intended to arrive, was something he was entirely certain he would remember for a considerable time. "You came," she said. "I said I would," he said. They went inside, where the Hargrove main room had been cleared of furniture, and a fiddler from the Birch Ranch was sawing through a Virginia reel with more enthusiasm than precision, and 30 people were making the floor shake. Seth Kendrick had not danced in years. He was not sure he had ever been what you would call a dancer, but Rosa Shepard took his hand with the confidence of a woman who was going to dance whether he was adequate to the task or not, and she taught him the steps with patient firmness. And by the second dance, he was managing tolerably, and by the third, he was not thinking about the steps at all. He was thinking about her hand in his and the warm smell of her hair, and the way she laughed when he turned the wrong direction, and she had to spin him back with both hands, and she said, "The other left, Seth," without a trace of anything but affection. Hattie Hargrove watched them from the corner of the room with the experienced eye of a woman who had been reading people for 50 years and found nothing surprising in what she saw. Her husband Frank said, quietly, so no one else could hear, "She seems happy." Hattie said, "She is going to be," and refilled her cider. Seth danced with Rosa until the fiddler took his first break, and then they went and stood outside in the cold, breathing the sharp night air, their breath rising together in white clouds. Above them the mountains were massive and dark against the stars, and the valley was very still, and the sound of voices and music from inside the warm house made the cold seem companionable rather than harsh. "Tell me something true," she said, looking at the mountains. He considered this. "I have been thinking about you every day since you left the cabin," he said. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without decoration, because that was the only way he knew to say important things and have them mean what they were supposed to mean. She turned and looked at him, and there was nothing uncertain in her face now, and nothing defended and nothing held back. Just her in the cold mountain night, looking at him with those dark, warm eyes. "I have been thinking about you too," she said. "Every day. I am not an easy man to know," he said, because it seemed important that she have all the relevant information. "I am quiet in ways that people sometimes take for coldness, and they are not wrong that I am reserved, though they are wrong that it is coldness. I have lived alone for 4 years, and I know that has made me more set in my ways than is probably ideal. I do not dance well. I do not talk enough at the wrong times and too much at the right ones. I have nothing to offer you except a rough cabin and hard country," and he paused, "my genuine regard, which I mean in the strongest possible sense of that phrase." She looked at him for a long time after he finished, and then she said, "Seth Kendrick, I was engaged to a charming man who danced beautifully and talked elegantly and had nothing real to offer at all, and I know exactly what that cost me. I do not need charm and I do not need elegance. I need someone honest. I need someone who means what they say." She took a step toward him. "You are the most honest person I have met in a very long time." He reached out and put his hand against the side of her face, carefully, the way he did most things, with full attention and no waste of movement, and she leaned into it the way she had leaned into his chest in the cold, asleep and warm and entirely trusting, and he thought, "There it is." "I mean it," he said, "in the strongest possible sense." "I know you do," she said. That is the whole point. He kissed her there in the cold outside the Hargrove homestead, with the fiddler starting up again inside, and the stars hard and clear above the San Juans, and it was nothing like the dramatic kisses described in the novels she carried in her carpet-bag. It was quieter than that, and more certain, and it tasted like cold air and black coffee, and the particular rightness of something that had been inevitable from the moment he had knelt in the snow beside a stranger and found a heartbeat. The weeks that followed were the best weeks Seth Kendrick had known in a long time, possibly the best weeks of his adult life, though he would not have said that out loud to anyone and would have been embarrassed to find it written down somewhere. He rode the 14 miles to the Hargrove homestead twice a week, which was twice as often as any practical errand required, and each time he found Rosa Shepard either in the yard with the children or in the small room the Hargroves had given her, or in the Hargrove kitchen helping Hattie with the considerable business of feeding a family of 6. And each time she looked up when he arrived with an expression of simple gladness that he found it impossible to be anything but completely undone by. Hattie Hargrove approved of him, which he suspected had something to do with the fact that he arrived with fresh game every visit and fixed the Hargroves' fence post without being asked, and was civil and useful, and did not outstay his welcome. Frank Hargrove shook his hand warmly and said little and seemed to find him satisfactory, which was the most Frank said about anything and was not to be taken lightly. The 4 Hargrove children, 3 boys and a girl ranging from 5 to 11, had decided that he was of interest primarily because of the stories he could tell about mountain animals, which was a form of approval he found completely comfortable to accept. He and Rosa walked every time he visited, out into the valley and along the creek, and sometimes up the lower slopes of the ridge where the elk trails cut through the aspens, and they talked the way people talk when they have found someone who genuinely listens, which is to say they talked about everything, the important things and the unimportant ones alike, with equal ease. She told him about her father, about the long, slow years of his illness, about the way she had managed the household and kept the accounts and made the money stretch in ways that required creativity and determination, and did not leave much room for being young in any normal sense of the word. He told her things he had not told anyone about Missouri, about the thing that had sent him west, which was simpler and sadder than she might have expected. A woman he had intended to marry who had decided, after some reflection, that a man with Seth's particular quietness and particular wildness, the part of him that had always been drawn to open land and cold air rather than walls and company, was not the settled domestic future she had in mind. He had taken that very hard, and he had come west to put some geography between himself and the taking of it, and the geography had turned out to suit him better than anything he had left behind, which was its own kind of answer. "Did you love her?" Rosa asked. "I thought I did," he said. "I think now that I love the idea of her, which is not the same thing. I loved the idea of having someone. I did not know her well enough to love her herself. And now," he looked at her sideways, "and now I think I know the difference." She looked straight ahead for a moment, watching a red-tailed hawk riding the thermal above the ridge, and then she said very quietly, "So do I." In April, when the snow had pulled back from the lower valley, and the aspens were beginning to show their first tentative green, Seth came down to the Hargrove homestead and found Rosa on the porch with a letter in her hand and a look on her face that was not quite sadness but something complicated and private. "From your sister?" he asked, sitting down on the porch step. "No, from Hartwell." She folded the letter carefully. "Thomas Purdy has married someone else. A widow from outside town with property and no children and no complications." She was quiet for a moment. "I am glad for them both," she said, and he believed her. "I am more glad for myself." She looked at him. "Does that make me terrible?" "That makes you honest," he said, "which is the thing I like best about you." She set the letter aside and she said, "Seth." The way she said his name had changed over the weeks since the dance. It had acquired a weight and a texture it had not had before, the way any word acquires weight when it is used by someone who means it. I want to stay in Colorado. I know I came to be with the Hargroves, and I am grateful for everything Hattie and Frank have given me, but I am—" She stopped. He waited. "I came to Colorado because I had nowhere else to go," she said. "And now I have somewhere to go, or I want to if—" She stopped again, and he saw the flush rise in her face, not quite embarrassment, but the visible evidence of a woman saying something important and not being entirely sure how it will land. "I'm trying to tell you that I want a life here, not just as Hattie Hargrove's helpful relation, a life of my own." She met his eyes. "I am not asking you to arrange that life for me. I know how to arrange my own life. I am only telling you where I want it to be, because you should know that." Seth looked at her for a long moment. The aspens shook in the spring wind, and the mountains were showing their first bare stone above the retreating snow line, and everything smelled of wet earth and pine sap and the beginning of things. "I have been thinking," he said carefully, "about whether a man with a rough cabin and 14 miles of mountain between him and the nearest settlement has any right to ask a woman to share that." She looked at him very steadily. "I have been thinking," he continued, "that the honest answer is probably no. He doesn't have the right to ask that unless the woman in question already knows exactly what it is and has decided for herself that she wants it anyway. And that the only way he could know whether she has decided that is if he asks her." Rosa Shepard looked at him with her coffee-dark eyes and her level chin, and that quality of absolute attention that he had come to understand was the deepest form of respect she knew how to offer, and she said, "Ask me." "Will you marry me, Rosa?" he said. He said it plainly and without ceremony, because that was the only way he knew to say it, and because plain was what had always worked between them, plain and direct, and without the kind of ornamentation that hid more than it revealed. She stood up from her chair and she came to the step where he was sitting, and she sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, and she looked out at the valley and the mountains and the spring sky above them, and she said, "Yes, Seth, I will marry you." He let out a breath. He had not known he had been holding one. They were married in June in the meadow below the pass, because Rosa had said she wanted to be married outside, and Seth had agreed with a simplicity that pleased her enormously. No argument, no discussion of the practical difficulties, just yes, outside is right, and which meadow do you prefer? The ceremony was performed by a circuit preacher named Dawes, who came through the San Juan Valley twice a year, and who was a small, energetic man with a booming voice that seemed designed for the open country. The Hargroves came, and Garrison from Durango, who said he had always known how this would go, and the Birch family from the neighboring ranch, and 2 other families from the valley whom Rosa had come to know through the winter and spring. Seth stood in the meadow in a good shirt with his hat in his hands, and when Rosa came through the aspens on Frank Hargrove's arm in a white dress that Hattie had helped her make over the preceding weeks, he felt something happen to his chest that he was fairly sure was his heart changing its fundamental arrangement. She was so beautiful, not in the conventional way that required particular lighting or particular angles, but in the way that people are beautiful when they are entirely themselves and entirely present and entirely glad to be where they are. She walked toward him with her chin level and her eyes bright, and she smiled when she reached him. Not the controlled almost smile, not the careful polite one, but the full real smile that he had first seen when she laughed at his story about the beaver, and that he had been trying to see as often as possible ever since. He took her hand, and Preacher Dawes said his words, and the mountains stood around them in their summer green, and when it was done and he kissed his wife in the meadow below the pass with the aspen leaves turning in the wind above them, the whole world felt, briefly, like it had been arranged correctly. They went back to his cabin, their cabin now, and she had brought a few things that made it different. The 3 books on a new shelf he had built for them, a blue curtain for the window that matched the dress she had worn to the Hargrove dance, a tin of tea that she kept beside his coffee. She had made him put in a second chair, and he had done it without argument, because he understood that 2 chairs instead of 1 was not a negotiation, but simply the obvious material form of the fact that they were 2 people now. The summer was the best summer Seth Kendrick had ever had in these mountains, which had given him several good ones. He showed Rosa the high country, the places above the tree line where the tundra flowers bloomed in improbable colors, and the sky was so close you felt you could put your hand through it. The high lakes where the water was so cold and clear you could count the stones on the bottom, the ridgeline from which, on a clear day, you could see what appeared to be most of Colorado spread out below you in every direction. She responded to all of it with the same quality of attention she brought to everything full and genuine, neither romanticizing it into something it was not nor reducing it with practicality into less than it was. She was good in the high country. She had good instincts for terrain and weather, and she was strong and she did not complain, and he taught her to shoot his spare rifle, and she was, after 6 weeks of practice, a better shot than he would have expected and better than she let on, he suspected, for the first several weeks. "You have been modest about this," he said one afternoon when she put 3 shots into a tin can at 80 yards. "I was not sure if you would be bothered by it," she said, lowering the rifle. He looked at her with genuine bewilderment. "Why would I be bothered by it?" She looked back at him for a moment, and he saw something cross her face, the residue of a life lived among people who had different ideas about what a woman should be capable of and how she should present that capability. "Some men," she said carefully, "prefer not to be outdone." "I am not some men," he said. "No," she said, looking at him with a directness that had moved well past analysis into something warmer. "You are not." And she handed him back the rifle and said, "Teach me to reload faster," with the smile that was becoming the single best thing in his daily landscape. In September, Rosa told him she was going to have a child, sitting across from him at their small table with her hands around her coffee cup, and her expression serious but not frightened, the expression of a woman who is giving important information to someone she trusts to receive it well. He was quiet for a moment, not a long one, but the particular silence he used when something genuinely big was passing through him, and he needed a moment to let it land fully before he spoke. Then he reached across the table and covered her hands with his, her hands still wrapped around the cup, and he said, "Are you well?" "Entirely," she said. "Good," he said. And he said it with such a depth of feeling that she set the cup down and turned her hands over to hold his, and she said, "Are you happy?" "I don't have words for what I am right now," he said, which from Seth Kendrick was everything. She wrote to Hattie Hargrove, who wrote back an extremely long letter full of practical advice and undisguised joy. She wrote to his sister Clara in St. Louis, because Clara had been corresponding with Rosa since shortly after the wedding, and they had taken to each other with a warmth that pleased Seth every time he thought about it. Clara wrote back a letter that made Rosa laugh and then almost cry, because it said, among other things, that she had been hoping for this particular development since Seth's letters had started arriving with the specific quality of a man who was being very carefully not mentioning someone who mattered. The winter was different with 2 of them in the cabin, which should have been obvious and was still somehow more true than he had expected. The silence was not silence anymore. It was the sound of Rosa reading aloud from one of her books while he worked on a new pair of snowshoes, or the sound of her moving around the kitchen with a competence and creativity that produced meals that were significantly better than anything he had managed alone, or the sound of her voice in the night when she was talking in her sleep, which she did occasionally, murmuring things he could never quite make out. He liked all of these sounds. He liked them more than he could easily have put into words, which for a man who was generally reserved about his feelings was not a small admission. They talked about everything during that winter. About what to name the child, a boy's name and a girl's name, argued over with friendly thoroughness. About whether to stay in the cabin or to build something larger before the spring. About the life they were building and what they wanted it to contain. About Rosa's father and Seth's sister, and the past that had shaped them both, and the future they were shaping together, and all the country between. There was one evening in January, almost a year from when he had found her in the snow, though neither of them marked it out loud. When they were sitting by the fire after supper, the mountain storm pressing the usual way against the walls, and Rosa had her head bent over a letter she was writing to Clara, and Seth was looking at the fire, and he said suddenly, "I almost missed you." She looked up. "I ran my trap line late that day," he said. "I almost did not go to the East Ridge at all. I was going to wait until the next morning because the sky looked bad and I was thinking about the storm." He paused. "I went anyway because the Peters trap had been down a week and I did not want to lose it." She looked at him for a long time. Outside, the storm was exactly what it had been a year ago, the same mountain wind, the same heavy snow, the same deep closed-in sound of the world being covered over. Inside, the fire was the same fire, orange and jumping, and the two chairs they were sitting in faced each other the same way his one chair had faced his empty hearth. "But you didn't miss me," she said. "No," he said, "I didn't." She set her letter aside and she got up from her chair and she came and sat on the arm of his and she put her head against the side of his, and he put his arm around her, careful and warm, and they stayed there in the firelight listening to the storm, which could not touch them, which had never really been able to touch them since the first night it had tried. "Seth," she said, "I am so glad you went to the East Ridge." "So am I," he said, with a quiet and absolute conviction that required nothing added to it. Their son was born in April, when the snow was leaving the valley floor, and the mountains above were still white, and the aspens were in their first pale green, and he came into the world with a considerable amount of noise, which Seth found privately reassuring as evidence of lung capacity. They named him James, which had been Seth's father's name, and which Rosa had suggested on the basis that it was a good solid name that would serve a boy well in rough country, and Seth had agreed because he had been moved more than he expected by the offer. James Kendrick had his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair, and an opinion about everything from his first week of life, which Rosa said showed excellent character and Seth said showed excellent stubbornness, and they were both right. Hattie Hargrove came over the pass in May to visit, riding her reliable gray mare with a basket of things for the baby and opinions about their cabin that were delivered with the frank goodwill of a woman who considers honesty a form of affection. She looked at their cabin and said it needed a proper kitchen added on the west side, and she looked at the baby and said he had the Kendrick jaw and would be trouble in 10 years, and she looked at Seth and Rosa together and she said, in the private moment she managed to arrange with Rosa while Seth was outside with Frank, "You look like a woman who has exactly what she wanted." "I do," Rosa said. "Good," said Hattie. "It looks well on you." The kitchen addition happened that summer, and while it was being built Seth also expanded the main room and put in 2 additional windows that Rosa had been suggesting with admirable patience for the better part of a year. And the result was a cabin that was no longer really a cabin, but something that was growing into a proper home, rough-hewn and mountain-solid, but with light coming in and space for the life that was being lived in it. James was 9 months old when Seth came in from the trap line one October evening to find Rosa at the new kitchen table with a letter in front of her, and an expression on her face that he read immediately as significant. "Clara is coming," she said. He stopped. "My sister Clara. She says she has been wanting to make the trip for 2 years and she has finally arranged it." Rosa looked up with a smile that was both excited and slightly amused. "She says she will stay for 6 weeks if we can stand her, and she promises to be useful." Seth sat down. He had not seen his sister in 5 years. He was quiet for a moment, working through something he had not expected to need to work through, not reluctance, exactly, but the adjustment required when a life you have built for yourself in solitude, and then built again for 2, is about to expand further. He looked at his wife and his son and his home and his mountain, and then he said, "She is more than welcome." Clara Kendrick arrived in November, on a clear cold day when the first serious snow had capped the peaks, and the lower valley was still holding its color, and she was younger than Rosa had pictured from the letters 26, with Seth's gray eyes in a warmer face and a quality of lively directness that was entirely her own. She looked at the cabin and she looked at Seth and she said, "You look happy, Seth, which is a thing I was not entirely certain I would live to see." And Seth said, "Thank you, Clara," in the measured tone of a man receiving a significant compliment with appropriate dignity. And Clara laughed and hugged him, and then turned and hugged Rosa with the warmth of a woman who had been corresponding with this person for a year, and considered the gap between correspondent and friend already well closed. She was, as advertised, useful. She cooked well, and she was good with James, who took to her immediately and sat on her lap with the settled confidence of a baby who has correctly identified a reliable adult. And she and Rosa spent long evenings at the kitchen table talking in the way that women talk when they have found a genuine and equal friendship, with both laughter and the serious undercurrent that serious things require. One evening near the end of her visit, when James was in his cradle and Rosa had gone to sleep early after a long day, Seth and Clara sat by the fire alone, and she said, "She is extraordinary, Seth." "I know that," he said. "Do you tell her?" He looked at his sister. "Yes, Clara, I tell her." Clara looked into the fire for a moment. "I was so worried about you up here. For years, I thought, you know what I thought, that you had made yourself into someone who couldn't," she searched for the word, "receive anything, anyone. I thought you had gone too far in the direction of needing nothing." "I thought that too," he said honestly. "And then you wrote me letters that were very carefully not about a particular woman and very obviously completely about her. And I thought, there it is." She smiled into the fire. "I am very glad, Seth." "So am I," he said. The fire talked between them, the same fire it had always been. "So am I, Clara." She went back to St. Louis in December, on a clear, cold morning that was better traveling weather than she had any right to expect in the San Juans in winter. And she left with a carpetbag full of Seth's best fur samples for a buyer she knew in St. Louis, and with Rosa's 3 books, loaned with the agreement that she would send them back with whatever new ones she thought worth the trouble, and with the particular bittersweet quality of a woman leaving a place she has grown to love but must leave anyway. Rosa stood at the door of the cabin and watched the trail until Clara was out of sight, and Seth stood behind her with his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him the way she did when something was bittersweet and she wanted the ballast of him. "I will miss her," she said. "She will be back," he said. "She said so, and she means things she says. She is like you that way." "She is better than me in most ways," he said. "She always was." Rosa turned in his arms and looked up at him. James was on her hip, warm and drowsy in the cold air, already trying to pull at Seth's coat buttons with fat, uncertain fingers. Seth put one hand over his son's head, the way he did with that particular careful attention he brought to everything that mattered, and he looked at his wife in the winter light and he thought, 4 years alone on this mountain, and then a storm and a woman in the snow and everything that came after, and this is where it arrived. Here, right here. "Come inside," Rosa said. "It is cold." "It is," he said. "Come on, then." He held the door for her, and she went in with the baby, and the warmth of the fire came out to meet them, and he stepped in after and pulled the door closed on the cold. And inside the cabin everything was theirs, the fire and the 2 chairs and the blue curtain on the window and the row of books and the sounds of a child and a woman and a life. And the mountain stood over all of it in its reliable white silence, keeping the snow, keeping the cold, unable to touch any of this. 3 years passed in the San Juan Mountains with the quality of time that passes well, not quickly, because well-passed time is not fast, it is full. And in those 3 years Seth and Rosa Kendrick built their life with the same quiet determination that they brought to everything, steadily and without drama, one season into the next. James learned to walk in the spring of his 2nd year, and spent the summer falling down with complete equanimity and getting up again, which Rosa said was the Kendrick jaw expressing itself, and Seth said was good sense. And they were both watching him with a love so large and simple that it sat between them like a physical thing, warm and reliable, every time they watched their son discover the world. The cabin grew by one more room that second year, a proper bedroom separated from the main room, because Rosa had pointed out with characteristic directness that a family of 3 living in one room was manageable, but a bedroom door was not a luxury. It was a civilized necessity, and Seth had agreed and built it over the course of 2 weeks in July, and Rosa had hung a curtain in the doorway before the door frame was even finished, which made him laugh in the low, quiet way he had. Garrison at the trading post in Durango became a reliable friend to both of them, not just a commercial connection. A man who kept his eye on the news coming up from the south and east, and who told them what they needed to know about the world beyond their mountain in the same spirit that he had always traded in information, which was to say freely, and with the confidence of a man who believes knowledge is for sharing. He told them in the spring of 1876 that Colorado was moving toward statehood, which was official that August, and Rosa celebrated this in her particular way by baking something that used the last of their sugar and writing a very long and spirited letter to Clara in St. Louis about what it meant for women in this territory, which Clara wrote back about at equal length and with equal spirit. The question of what statehood meant for the people who had been in this country far longer than any homesteader was one that sat heavier in those years than some people acknowledged, and Rosa was not one of the people who failed to acknowledge it. She had met several Ute families in the valley during her first year at the Hargrove homestead, and she had watched with a clear and uncomfortable clarity as the territory's government pushed its pressure westward in ways that dispossessed people from land they had lived on for generations. She talked about this with Seth in the evenings, and he listened as he always listened with his full attention, and without the dismissiveness she had learned was more common than not among the men she encountered. And he said that he had thought about it too, that he had built his life on mountain land that had been someone else's in a way that the law did not acknowledge, and that he tried to acknowledge within himself, because acknowledging a thing honestly seemed better than the alternative of simply not looking at it. These were not conversations that resolved into simple conclusions, because there were no simple conclusions to be had. But Rosa found that having them with a man who would not flinch from the discomfort of them was its own form of essential. She had always known, since the first night when he had told her very plainly that sitting down in the snow was how people died in these mountains, that Seth Kendrick was a man who did not soften hard things into comfortable untruths, and in 4 years of knowing him, she had never once found a reason to be anything but grateful for this. In the autumn of 1876, Rosa told him again, sitting at the table in the morning with her hands around her coffee and her eyes calm and certain, that she was expecting another child. James was 2.5 and sitting on the kitchen floor making significant architectural structures out of wooden blocks that Seth had cut for him over the summer, and the October light was coming in through both of the windows that Rosa had wanted, and Seth looked at his wife across the breakfast table and said, with the same plainness and the same depth, "Are you well?" "Entirely," she said. "Good," he said. And this time she got up from her chair and came around the table, and he stood and put his arms around her, all of her. And James looked up from his blocks and said, "Papa," in the authoritative tone of a child who considers parental embrace a publicly available activity, and came and attached himself to Seth's leg. And Seth looked down at his son and up at his wife, and the October light was very good. Their daughter arrived in March of 1877, on a cold, clear night when the stars were extraordinary, and Seth had been pacing the main room for 3 hours while Hattie Hargrove, who had crossed the pass 2 days ago in anticipation, managed everything with the brisk competence of a woman who had done this many times, and considered a nervous father the primary hazard in any birthing situation. The baby came into the world with less noise than James had. She was a watchful child from the first moments, her dark eyes open, and taking everything in with a gravity that Rosa said was unmistakably Seth's. They named her Margaret, which had been Rosa's mother's name, and which sat in the cabin with a warmth and a weight that made Rosa hold her daughter and think of the long chain of women back through time who had made her possible, in Missouri, and before Missouri, and wherever before that, all the way down to this mountain cabin in Colorado, and this particular cold March night. Seth held his daughter with the same careful attention with which he held everything fragile and important fully, both hands, nothing casual, and he looked at her face, and he said to Rosa, very quietly, "She has your eyes. She has your expression," Rosa said. "God help her," he said, and Rosa laughed, genuinely and fully, and Hattie Hargrove, standing in the doorway, allowed herself a very small smile before she turned away to give them their privacy. The years settled into themselves after that, the way good years do, not into complacency, but into a kind of deep familiar rhythm that held the extraordinary and the ordinary in the same basket without making either less. James grew into a sturdy and observant boy who was most himself outdoors, who followed his father on trap lines by the time he was 5, and could name a track in the snow by the time he was 6, and who had his mother's directness and his father's patience in a combination that was both useful and slightly alarming. Margaret grew into a quiet and fierce small person who had opinions about everything, and expressed them with a precision that went well beyond her years, and who had decided by the time she could speak clearly that she wanted to learn to read as fast as possible, and would accept no substitutes for books in the meantime. Seth built a proper barn in the spring of 1878, because they had acquired a horse and a milk cow and 2 goats that Rosa had decided were necessary after a prolonged campaign in which she presented the case for goats with an efficiency that left no room for counterargument, and a barn was the obvious solution. He also, that same year, built a second cabin room off the north side of the existing one, because James had been sharing the main room with the baby for a year, and the arrangement worked but just barely. And Seth had calculated that 2 more rooms would solve problems they would otherwise face in another year, and that it was better to build ahead of necessity than behind it. Rosa stood in the yard one evening in September of 1878, looking at what their place had become, the original cabin that Seth had built alone before she existed to him, and the kitchen addition, and the bedroom, and the 2 new rooms and the barn, all of it connected and expanding with the organic logic of a place that was genuinely lived in by people who intended to keep living in it. And she felt something she identified after a moment as the specific joy of having made something real. Not found something real, but made it. She and Seth together, out of rough logs and hard country, and 4 years of choosing each other every day in small ways and large ones. Seth came and stood beside her, James on his shoulders looking at the darkening peaks above the tree line, and Margaret on his hip pointing at the goats with the focused interest of a child who has not yet decided whether goats are comic or serious. And Rosa looked at all of them. The man she had found in the same moment he found her, the children who had come from that finding, the home that had grown up around all of it like a living thing. And she thought, "I came west with nothing and I have everything." "What are you looking at?" Seth asked. "Everything," she said. He looked at her for a moment, reading her face the way he read weather and terrain, and all the things he had learned to read in 4 years of mountain living with full attention and no hurry. Then he said, "Yes, that is about right." Clara came back the following spring, as she had promised, and as Rosa had been quietly certain she would, and this time she came with something she had not brought on her first visit. A man named William Carr, a St. Louis schoolteacher who was mild and decent and clearly in love with Seth's sister in a way that Seth assessed as entirely genuine after one dinner and never revised his assessment of. Clara introduced him with the combination of challenge and hopefulness that people use when they are presenting something important to someone whose opinion matters, and Seth shook his hand and said, "You are welcome here," with a completeness that made Clara exhale in relief and Rosa squeeze her hand under the table. They stayed for a month, and in that month William Carr proved himself exactly what he appeared to be, a good and earnest man who was improved by Clara's company, and who added something genuine to every conversation he was part of, and when they left to go back to St. Louis, Seth shook his hand again and said, "Treat her well," which William Carr said he intended to do and which Seth believed. Clara and William were married that fall, and the letter they sent Rosa and Seth about the wedding was full of happiness in every line, the kind of happiness that is so genuine it comes through paper and distance without any diminishment. And Rosa read it aloud at the kitchen table, and Seth listened with his coffee going cool and his children asleep down the hall and the fire doing its reliable work. And when she finished he said, "Good. She deserves that." "She does," Rosa said. She folded the letter and set it on the shelf with the others, a growing collection now, the visible record of a life in correspondence with the people who mattered. She looked at Seth across the table, and he looked at her, and between them was everything that had passed in the years since a storm and an east ridge and a woman sleeping in the snow, all of it, still warm, still present, still the most important thing. "Seth," she said. "Rosa," he said, "do you remember what you said to me? The first thing you said, when I woke up in the cabin that first night." He was quiet for a moment, thinking back to that cold February evening, the fire and the shadows and the woman sitting up in his blankets looking around her with those dark, careful eyes. "I said you were warm now," he said. "You did," she said. She smiled at him slowly, the way she smiled when something was both simple and entirely right. "That was the best thing you could have said." He looked at her, this woman he had carried 3 miles through mountain snow without waking, this woman he had made coffee for and built a life with and stood beside in every weather since, and he said, "It was the only thing that mattered right then." "It is still the only thing that matters," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand the way he had on that first morning she told him about the baby covering it, warm and certain. And outside the mountain was doing what it always did, keeping its cold and its distance and its particular wild beauty. And inside the lamp was burning and the fire was talking and the children were sleeping and everything Seth Kendrick had built in these mountains. Alone first and then together, log by log and season by season. All of it accumulated into this one present moment at a kitchen table with a woman who had come out of a snowstorm and changed every single thing was exactly, precisely, irreversibly right. He did not need to say that out loud. She already knew. She had always known, from the moment she had woken to the warmth and found him sitting in the chair watching over her with that quiet and total attention that was the clearest language he had. They sat together in the light of their home while the mountain kept the cold outside, and the Colorado night came down over the San Juans in its wide and ordinary splendor, and they were warm, and they were known, and they were entirely, finally home.